The neighbors laughed and told him it would never work. A retired veteran wrapped his small winter house in a wooden shed, believing it would protect him from the cold. With only his loyal German shepherd by his side, he ignored the whispers and kept building as snow crept closer. But when a brutal winter storm hit and the entire neighborhood began to freeze, something unexpected happened inside that strange shed-wrapped home. While others struggled with wet firewood and icy rooms, his house stayed warm and his firewood stayed perfectly dry. What seemed like a foolish idea would soon silence the laughter force. The town to rethink everything they believed about winter survival and quietly change the life of one old soldier forever. Before we dive in, tell us where you're watching from. Drop your city, state, or country in the comments below. It's always incredible to see how far these stories travel. Winter arrived early in Duluth, carried on a hard wind rolling off Lake Superior, sharp enough to sting the skin and heavy with wet snow that refused to stop falling. Walter Hayes stood in his yard before dawn, boots sunk into slush breath fogging the gray air, staring at the old wooden house he had lived in for nearly 12 years. He was 67 tall, but slightly stooped with broad shoulders that hinted at the strength he once carried more easily, now softened by age and old injuries that ached when the cold crept deep into his bones. His face was deeply lined, not from laughter, but from long silences, his jaw square and weathered, covered in a rough salt and pepper beard he trimmed only when it became inconvenient. Beneath a faded wool cap, thin gray hair clung stubbornly to his head, and his eyes, steel blue, watchful, tired, held the distant look of a man who had seen too much and learned to speak too little. He wore the same thick red and black buffalo plaid flannel jacket every winter, the fabric heavy and frayed at the cuffs, a relic from years ago that still smelled faintly of wood smoke and oil, a jacket that had followed him home from war and never quite left his shoulders. Beside him stood Rex, a 9-year-old German shepherd with a silver sable coat, dusted lighter around the muzzle, amber eyes alert, despite his age, ears still proud, but slightly scarred from old scrapes. Rex moved with the calm confidence of a dog who had learned patience from long winters and loyalty from a man who spoke more with his hands than his voice, always staying close enough that his shoulder nearly brushed Walter's knee, as if anchoring him to the present. Walter lifted a hammer, adjusted a pine board against a rough frame he had started building weeks earlier, and drove the first nail in as the sound echoed sharply through the cold morning. By the time the sun rose weakly through the clouds, the neighbors had noticed. Duluth was no stranger to winter, and people prided themselves on knowing how to survive it, which was why they paused on sidewalks and slowed their trucks when they saw what Walter was doing. He wasn't repairing his house. He was wrapping it. 8 feet out from every wall he was building a second structure, a continuous shed that encircled the cabin entirely, like a wooden shell grown awkwardly around a simpler core. Sarah Whitman was the first to stop and stare. She lived 2 houses down, a woman in her early 40s, with a narrow frame, pale skin that flushed easily in the cold, and chestnut hair, usually tied back in a practical ponytail beneath a knitted hat. Sarah worked mornings at the local bakery, and the smell of flour seemed permanently embedded in her coats. She was kind by nature, cautious by habit, and had learned skepticism the hard way after losing her husband to a logging accident years earlier. She crossed her arms tightly against the wind and watched Walter measure boards with slow precision, her brow furrowing, not in mockery, but confusion. "You building a barn?" she finally asked, her voice carrying just enough humor to soften the question. Walter glanced up, nodded once in greeting, and went back to his work without answering. A few minutes later, James Callahan rolled by in his pickup and leaned out the window. James was 55, thick-necked, red-faced, with a booming voice and a mustache. He groomed carefully, a man who enjoyed being heard and enjoyed even more being right. Hayes, he called, laughing openly. Now you know winter comes from all directions, not just one. You planning to heat 2 houses now? A couple of other neighbors chuckled, the sound light, but dismissive, and James shook his head as he drove off. Rex let out a low warning huff, but Walter rested a gloved hand on the dog's neck, grounding him. Walter had learned long ago that laughter rarely meant cruelty. More often, it meant misunderstanding. As the days passed, the structure took shape. The outer wall rose to shoulder height, rough pine boards nailed with deliberate spacing between them. The roof sloped away from the house, channeling water outward. Snow melted and refroze along the edges, forming hard, crystalline lines that glimmered briefly before dulling again under fresh snowfall. Each afternoon, more neighbors stopped to comment. Some laughed openly. Others shook their heads. A few offered unsolicited advice, telling him the space between the walls would fill with snow, that rodents would nest there, that he was wasting good lumber on nothing but air. Walter listened without reacting, the way he had learned to listen during long military briefings, where the loudest voices were rarely the wisest. Inside his chest, though, his thoughts moved constantly. He remembered a different cold years earlier, when he had stood guard in freezing rain with numb fingers and soaked boots, knowing that moisture was as dangerous as any enemy. He remembered nights when equipment failed not because it was weak, but because it wasn't protected. He remembered how survival had always depended on anticipating the problem before it arrived. At night, when the wind rattled the bare branches and the house creaked softly, Walter lay awake, listening to Rex breathe steadily at the foot of the bed. He thought about the winters since he'd returned home, about hauling frozen, half-rotten firewood through knee-deep snow, about the way smoke had filled the room when damp logs refused to burn cleanly, about the quiet fear that came with each storm when the temperature dropped and the margins for error narrowed. He wasn't building out of stubbornness or pride. He was building out of memory. One afternoon, as sleet began to fall in a thin, relentless sheet, Sarah returned this time, bringing a thermos. She set it down carefully on a dry patch of ground and watched Rex pace the perimeter of the half-finished corridor, tail low but relaxed. "He's a good dog," she said softly. Walter nodded. "He watches," he replied after a long pause, his voice rough from disuse. Sarah smiled faintly, studying the space between the walls. "People are talking," she admitted, not unkindly. "They think you've lost your mind." Walter drove another nail, the hammer's rhythm steady. "They're warm enough now to think that," he said. Sarah didn't laugh. She looked at the sky, the heavy clouds pressing low, and shivered. As November crept closer, the laughter grew louder, but so did the wind. Snow began to pile against fences and cars. Other houses stacked their firewood outside, covering it with tarps that snapped and tore in the gusts. Walter stacked his wood inside the growing corridor, 4 feet deep along the inner wall, another stack forming along the outer edge, leaving a narrow walking path between them. Rex followed him everywhere, nose-twitching paws, leaving crisp prints in the thin layer of sawdust and snow. To the neighbors, it still looked foolish, an old veteran wasting his strength on a strange idea. To Walter, it already felt like shelter, like the calm before a test he knew was coming. On the last evening before the first true freeze, James Callahan stopped again, this time on foot, hands shoved into his coat pockets. He looked at the nearly completed wrap, then at Walter's face. "Hope you're right," he said, not laughing now. Walter met his gaze expression unreadable. "Me too," he answered quietly. As night fell and the temperature dropped sharply, Walter and Rex stood inside the narrow corridor, listening to the wind howl harmlessly beyond the outer wall. For the first time that season, Walter felt something close to certainty. The laughter behind him faded into the cold, but ahead lay winter itself, waiting to prove who was foolish and who was prepared. Walter Hayes did not explain himself, not to the neighbors who laughed, not to the ones who merely shook their heads, and not even to Sarah when she looked at him with quiet concern. He had learned long ago that explanations were a form of debt, and he no longer owed anyone reassurance. The cold had taught him that. Not the polite postcard winter people imagined when they spoke of snow, but the kind that crept in slowly, soaked through everything, and waited patiently for weakness. Walter knew this cold well. It was the same cold he had faced decades earlier in a different country wearing a different uniform, when damp boots and wet supplies mattered more than courage. Back then, men didn't freeze because the temperature dropped. They froze because something essential failed when it was needed most. Standing inside the half-finished shed corridor, Walter ran his gloved hand over a stack of pine logs he had split weeks before. The wood felt cool but firm dry beneath the surface. That alone eased a tension he carried constantly through the winter months, a tension that tightened each time he remembered other years, other mistakes. In those earlier winters in Duluth, he had stacked his firewood outside like everyone else, covering it with tarps that flapped uselessly in the wind. Rain would find its way in, soaking the ends of the logs, and then the freeze would come, sealing the moisture inside. He remembered nights when he fed the stove again and again, watching thick gray smoke curl uselessly from the chimney while the room stayed cold. He remembered Rex lying close to the hearth, his old joints stiff, his breath shallow, eyes following Walter, with quiet trust that felt heavier than any accusation. Rex was 9 now, his once dark muzzle frosted with gray, his body still powerful but slower, careful on ice. Walter often thought the dog had aged alongside him, shaped by the same silences, the same winters. Rex did not whine or beg. He simply endured, and that endurance was what haunted Walter the most. Each time the dog shivered, Walter felt the echo of responsibility, a reminder that survival was not only about oneself. The shed wrap was born from that feeling, not from stubborn pride. As the days shortened, Walter's routine became precise. He rose before dawn, fed Rex, and worked until his fingers numbed despite thick gloves. The outer wall boards were spaced carefully, not close enough to trap moisture, not wide enough to invite the weather inside. He stacked the firewood with deliberate order, the driest logs closest to the cabin wall, the newer ones toward the outer edge. As he worked, his mind wandered back to the military doctrine that had shaped him. Protect critical resources, create buffer zones, assume the worst conditions will arrive when you are least prepared. He had learned these lessons the hard way, after a winter patrol gone wrong, when supplies were left exposed to freezing rain. Men had suffered for that mistake, and the memory still surfaced uninvited whenever he smelled damp wood or heard sleet tap against glass. One afternoon, as freezing drizzle coated the ground in a slick sheen, Sarah returned again. She stood at the edge of the yard, her slim figure wrapped in a long coat, shoulders slightly hunched against the cold. Her skin was pale and fine-lined for her age, marked by years of early mornings and quiet resilience rather than hardship alone. Her eyes were observant brown and thoughtful, the kind that noticed details others overlooked. She watched Walter move logs from the splitter to the corridor, Rex padding behind him, and finally spoke. "You're afraid of something," she said, not accusing, just stating what she saw. Walter paused, resting one hand on the handle of the wheelbarrow. For a long moment he said nothing. Then, without looking at her, he replied, "I've seen what happens when people trust the weather." Sarah nodded slowly, understanding more than she said. She had trusted the woods once, too, trusted a routine, trusted that experience was enough. It hadn't been. That shared understanding settled between them like a quiet agreement. Word spread through the neighborhood that Walter was stockpiling more firewood than usual. James Callahan scoffed at the general store, his loud voice carrying across the aisles, as he told anyone who would listen that Hayes was preparing for an apocalypse that never came. Others laughed along, though some did so less confidently, now glancing outside at the persistent sleet coating the streets. Only one man stopped by without mockery. Thomas Reed, a retired dock worker in his early 70s, tall and lean with a narrow face and deeply set eyes, walked slowly up the drive one evening. Thomas had lost partial hearing from decades near heavy machinery and spoke softly, as a result his manner calm, almost tentative. He studied the shed wrap in silence, then looked at Walter. "You planning to keep it dry?" he said simply, gesturing toward the stacked wood. Walter nodded. Thomas smiled faintly. "Smart," he said, and left without another word. That single exchange stayed with Walter longer than all the laughter. As November advanced, the rain worsened. 3 straight days of cold drizzle soaked the town. Walter watched from his window as tarps sagged under the weight of water in neighboring yards, as puddles formed beneath exposed woodpiles. Rex paced restlessly, ears flicking at the sound of rain drumming on the outer roof. Inside the corridor, though, the air remained strangely calm. Moisture clung briefly to the outermost logs, but beneath the surface the stacks stayed dry. Walter tested them each evening, splitting one log open to check the grain. The wood cracked cleanly, releasing the sharp scent of pine, and each time it did something inside, Walter loosened. At night he slept more deeply than he had in years. He dreamed less of frozen hands and failed equipment, less of shouting over wind and rain. Instead, his dreams were quiet, filled with steady warmth and the sound of Rex breathing nearby. On the 4th morning, the temperature dropped suddenly. Rain turned to ice overnight, coating everything in a hard, glassy shell. Walter stepped outside carefully, boots crunching, and surveyed the yard. His neighbors were already out, cursing softly as they tried to free frozen tarps and pry logs apart with numb fingers. Smoke rose unevenly from chimneys thick and dark. Walter walked into the corridor lantern light reflecting off the stacked wood and selected a few logs from the inner pile. They were dry exactly as he had hoped. As he carried them inside, Rex followed closely, tail swaying in slow contentment. When the fire caught quickly and burned clean, filling the room with real heat instead of smoke, Walter stood still for a long time, hands resting on the back of a chair. This was why he had built the shed. Not to prove anything, not to silence laughter, but to remove uncertainty. Wet firewood had always represented more than inconvenience to him. It was a symbol of failure, of being caught unprepared, of trusting conditions that did not care whether you survived. That night, as the wind howled and ice cracked in the trees, Walter sat beside Rex and listened to the stove hum steadily. The neighbors' laughter echoed faintly in his memory, but it no longer touched him. Outside, winter tightened its grip on Duluth. Inside, Walter felt ready. The real test was still ahead, but the first battle against moisture, against neglect, against memory, had already been won. November tightened its grip without warning, the kind of shift that fooled people into thinking they still had time. 3 days of cold rain soaked Duluth from roofline to root the water, sliding sideways on the wind, finding gap seams and every careless edge. Then overnight, the temperature collapsed below 0. What had been wet turned solid, and what had been solid turned treacherous. Walter Hayes woke before dawn to the sound of ice ticking against the outer roof of the shed. Rap a brittle, hollow rhythm that told him exactly what had happened. He pulled on his flannel jacket, its weight familiar and grounding, and stepped into the corridor with a lantern. The air there felt different, still, protected, carrying the faint, resinous scent of pine rather than the metallic bite of freezing rain. Rex followed at an unhurried pace, nails clicking softly on the planks. His silvered muzzle lifted as he inhaled, alert but calm. Walter ran his hand along the outermost stack first. The surface logs were cold, lightly damp where wind-driven rain had slipped through the spaced boards. But when he rolled one aside, the interior revealed pale, dry wood end grain already showing the fine cracks of proper seasoning. He moved inward deeper toward the cabin wall, and there the logs were dry to the core, as if November had passed them by entirely. He chose 6, balanced them in his arms, and carried them inside. The stove took them easily. The fire caught clean, bright, the flame steady instead of sullen, and the familiar smell of good heat filled the room. Walter stood watching until the iron warmed beneath his palm, a small private ritual that told him the day would be manageable. Across the street, the difference announced itself in smoke. Thick gray plumes rose unevenly from chimneys drifting low and heavy. Walter heard the thud of axes striking frozen rounds, the crack of wood splitting reluctantly, the muttered curses of men whose plans had not accounted for moisture. James Callahan's place was the loudest. James was built for confidence, broad chest, thick neck, mustache waxed to sharp ends, and he had built his winter routines the same way assuming force would compensate for conditions. Walter watched from his window as James and his teenage son wrestled with frozen logs, breath-puffing white, their movements sharp with frustration. Even when they got a fire going, smoke leaked from every seam, and the front windows stayed filmed with frost. Sarah Whitman came by mid-morning, careful on the ice, her narrow boots leaving shallow prints. She paused at the edge of the yard, eyes drawn first to the chimney. "Your smoke looks different," she said, not accusing, just observant. Walter nodded and stepped aside, inviting her in. The corridor surprised her. She slowed instinctively, brushing her gloved fingers along the boards, feeling the absence of wind. Sarah was slim and slightly stooped from habit rather than age, her chestnut hair tucked beneath a wool cap, pale skin flushed pink from the cold. She had learned to read rooms and people quietly, since her husband's death, and now she read the space with the same careful attention. "It's dry," she said, surprised. Walter handed her a split log. She tested it with her thumb, then smiled faintly. "So this is why," she murmured. Outside, the neighborhood moved into crisis mode. Tarps froze stiff boards, weighed down with rocks, trapped water underneath, and every exposed pile became a locked mass. Thomas Reed passed by once, walking slowly, hands clasped behind his back. He stopped, glanced at Walter's chimney, then at the corridor, and offered a small nod of recognition before continuing on. By afternoon, the wind rose, carrying fine ice crystals that rattled against siding and stung exposed skin. Inside Walter's house, the temperature climbed steadily. By evening, Rex lay stretched on the floor, belly up, paws loose, eyes half closed in a way that only happened when he felt entirely safe. The sight struck Walter unexpectedly. He found himself smiling, not the guarded curve he used for neighbors, but a genuine release that softened his lined face. It had been years since he'd allowed himself that. The storm returned 2 days later, heavier this time. Wet snow fell thick and fast, 18 inches in less than a day, piling against fences and burying cars. The weight bent tree limbs until they snapped with sharp reports that echoed through the streets. Walter walked the corridor as the snow accumulated, listening to it slide harmlessly down the sloped outer roof, watching it bank away from the foundation instead of against it. The ventilation gaps allowed enough air to move that snow did not drift inside. The passage remained clear, accessible. He selected wood without haste while others dug. Late that night, there was a knock. Walter opened the door to find Mark Jensen standing on the step, shoulders hunched, beard rimed with ice. Mark was in his early 40s, lean to the point of gauntness with sharp cheekbones and tired eyes that suggested he carried more worry than he admitted. He worked maintenance at the high school, a quiet man who avoided confrontation, shaped by years of doing necessary work without recognition. "I hate to ask," Mark said, voice tight with cold, "but my wood's useless. Could I buy a few logs?" Walter didn't hesitate. He handed Mark an armful, refusing payment with a brief shake of his head. Mark's relief was immediate, visible in the way his shoulders dropped. Word spread quickly after that, not through gossip, but through observation. People noticed which houses stayed warm and which didn't. They noticed the difference in smoke and sound, in how often doors opened and closed in the cold. By December 1st, the contrast had become undeniable. Sarah began keeping notes, something she did when uncertainty made her restless. She recorded temperatures. She heard neighbors mention how often they cut more wood, how long fires lasted. One evening she borrowed a moisture meter from a friend whose brother worked timber surveys up north. The numbers confirmed what everyone could already feel. Walter's inner stack read between 12 and 14%. Exposed piles across the street climbed past 30. The data didn't gloat. It simply existed, quiet and irrefutable. James Callahan stopped laughing. He came by alone, hat in hand, mustache drooping with melted frost. He stood in the corridor, saying nothing for a long time, eyes tracing the geometry, the spacing, the logic he had dismissed. "I thought you were wasting space," he admitted finally, voice lower than Walter had ever heard it. Walter shrugged. "I was saving time," he said. The storm cycle broke at last, leaving a hard, bright cold in its wake. Duluth exhaled cautiously. People repaired what they could, took stock, and remembered. Walter and Rex sat together by the stove, the house warm and quiet. The first difference had been made not in speeches or arguments, but in heat held and effort spared. Walter knew that the winter was far from over. But the trap had sprung, and it had not caught him. It had revealed him. The storm arrived without ceremony, a heavy, wet snowfall that began at dusk and did not let up until morning, laying nearly half a meter of dense white weight across Duluth and pressing the town into a slower, more cautious rhythm. Snow clung to everything, railings bowed, fences disappeared, and the tops of outdoor woodpiles vanished beneath a compacted blanket that hardened by the hour. The wind followed, steady and cutting, forcing its way through seams and corners where it could, and people woke to the sound of scraping shovels and strained voices. Walter Hayes stepped into his shed-wrapped corridor at first light and felt the same quiet certainty he had felt the day before. The air there was calm, insulated from the gale, the planks beneath his boots dry and sure. Rex moved alongside him, his silver sable coat fluffed against the cold amber eyes, bright tail swaying slowly, as if he understood that this morning was different. Walter walked the length of the passage without haste, selecting wood, with the ease of habit, his gloved fingers tracing grain and weight, as though greeting old friends. The snow slid down the outer roof in soft, constant sheets, falling away from the foundation and piling harmlessly at a distance. Inside the corridor, the stacked cords stood accessible, the walking path opened the space, doing exactly what it had been designed to do. Outside the wrap, the neighborhood struggled. James Callahan and his son hacked at a drift that had swallowed their woodpile shovels, striking ice with dull thuds that carried across the street. Smoke rose from several chimneys in uneven bursts, thick and gray, a visible sign of damp fuel fighting to burn. Walter lit his stove and felt the heat gather quickly, clean and reliable. Rex circled once and settled near the warmth, stretching long and loose, a picture of comfort that would have been unthinkable in past winters. By mid-morning, footsteps crunched cautiously up Walter's drive. Sarah Whitman arrived first, cheeks flushed, her long coat dusted white. She stood at the threshold of the corridor, pausing instinctively as the wind died at the boundary. Her slim frame relaxed almost immediately, shoulders dropping, as she took in the stillness. Sarah's hair had escaped its tie, chestnut strands framing her face, and her pale skin carried the tired look of someone who had been up since before dawn. She didn't speak at first. She simply watched Walter move through the space with quiet efficiency, Rex trailing him like a living shadow. "It's like another season in here," she said finally, voice low with awe. Walter nodded, not smiling, but the corners of his eyes softened. A little later, Thomas Reed appeared tall and spare, moving carefully, with the deliberation of age and a lifetime of listening more than speaking. He studied the corridor with a craftsman's eye, one hand resting on the outer boards, feeling the airflow, the spacing. "You kept the weather outside and the work inside," he observed. Walter inclined his head. Word traveled quickly now, not with laughter, but with need. Mark Jensen returned this time without embarrassment, his lean face drawn but steadier than before. He brought a small sack of coffee beans as thanks, a simple offering that meant more than payment. Behind him came others, neighbors Walter had exchanged, little more than nods with over the years, each arriving with the same cautious curiosity, stepping into the corridor and feeling the sudden absence of wind. One by one, they stopped talking. The laughter that had once followed Walter's work evaporated in the face of warmth you could stand in without bracing yourself. Among the visitors was Evelyn Carter, a woman in her late 50s with cropped gray hair and a firm, upright posture that suggested years of responsibility. She had been a school administrator before retiring early to care for an ailing sister, a role that had sharpened her practicality and dulled her patience for nonsense. Evelyn ran a hand along the stacked wood and nodded. "You didn't build more house," she said. "You built margin." Walter looked at her, surprised by the precision of the word, and felt a quiet respect settle in his chest. Outside, the storm continued to test the town. Snowdrifts deepened, and the temperature hovered just low enough to keep everything heavy and wet. People burned through their supplies faster than planned, hauling more wood through snow that soaked boots and stiffened joints. Inside Walter's home, the stove hummed steadily. He brewed coffee for his visitors, the smell mingling with pine and iron, and listened as questions replaced jokes. How wide was the gap? Why the spacing between boards? "What about rodents?" Walter answered simply without flourish, explaining principles rather than boasting about outcomes. Rex watched the newcomers carefully. His posture relaxed, but attentive, accepting quiet hands on his head, with dignified patience. As afternoon faded, James Callahan appeared again, hat clutched in both hands. His face looked different now, less ruddy, more thoughtful, and his mustache drooped, unstyled. He stood in the corridor, eyes moving from the roof pitch to the wood stacks to the inner wall of the cabin. "I called it stupid," he said, voice rough. "I was wrong." Walter didn't respond immediately. He had learned that apologies mattered most when they weren't rushed. Finally, he said, "Winter doesn't care what we call things." James let out a breath that might have been a laugh once, then nodded. The visits tapered off as darkness approached. People returned to their own homes with new measurements in mind, new questions forming. Walter closed the door and sat by the stove, Rex's head resting against his shin. Outside, the wind pressed on, but inside time felt wider, slower, as if the house itself had exhaled. Walter thought about the years he had spent preparing alone, about the laughter that had followed him like a cold echo, and realized that silence had replaced it, not an awkward silence, but a thoughtful one. The kind that meant people were recalibrating, adjusting old assumptions. He did not feel triumphant. He felt relieved. He had not set out to teach a lesson. He had set out to survive with dignity. The storm eased by morning, leaving a town marked by the evidence of what had worked and what had not. Walter walked the corridor once more, checking stacks, listening to the quiet. Rex padded beside him, content. When he looked out at the street, he saw neighbors measuring distances, with their eyes tracing imaginary lines around their own houses. The laughter was gone, replaced by a deeper, more useful sound thinking. By the time February loosened its grip on Duluth, winter had revealed its verdict, with a clarity that no argument could undo. Walter Hayes noticed it first in the quiet routines of his days, in the way the woodpile inside the corridor had thinned more slowly than it ever had before, in the steady warmth of the rooms, even on mornings when the temperature sank far below zero. He kept no ledger, but Sarah did, and she brought her notes one afternoon, cheeks flushed from the cold, her slim frame wrapped in a long gray coat dusted with salt stains from icy sidewalks. She sat at Walter's small kitchen table, pale hands spread over pages of careful handwriting, brown eyes intent. "You're burning almost half of what the others are," she said softly, as if afraid to disturb the evidence. Walter shrugged his square shoulders, lifting beneath the familiar red and black flannel. He had always trusted outcomes more than explanations. Rex lay at his feet, 9 years old now, his silvered muzzle resting on crossed paws, amber eyes half-lidded in the deep comfort of consistent heat. The dog's joints had stiffened less this winter. He rose more easily, climbed the porch steps without hesitation. Walter noticed these things with a soldier's attention to small improvements that meant survival. Across the street, James Callahan had begun measuring distances with a tape, his broad figure hunched against the wind mustache, now streaked with gray where frost lingered. The man who once laughed loudest now spoke carefully, asking questions instead of making declarations. He stopped by one morning with his son, the boy quiet and observant, his cheeks chapped red. James's voice lacked its former bluster as he stood in the corridor, tracing the airflow with his hand. "How far out did you build it?" he asked. Walter answered plainly. 8 feet. "Why not more?" James pressed. Walter met his gaze steady. More wastes lumber. Less traps, moisture. James nodded slowly, the lesson landing not as humiliation, but as relief. Others followed. Evelyn Carter returned with a notebook of her own, her cropped gray hair neat beneath a wool cap, posture straight despite the cold. She asked practical questions, the kind that came from years of solving problems for other people, rather than impressing them. Mark Jensen arrived again, this time with his wife Anna, a soft-spoken woman with dark hair braided tightly against the wind, her hands rough from work, her eyes kind but wary. They stood together, listening, absorbing. Walter never lectured. He showed. He walked them through the corridor, let them feel the still air, the dryness, the ease of access. He split a log and let the clean crack speak for him. When someone asked why it worked, he gestured simply, one gloved hand indicating the gap, the other resting briefly on Rex's head. "Don't let the cold touch what keeps you alive," he said, the words stripped of drama, shaped by memory rather than theory. Sarah wrote that sentence down. By early March, the numbers spoke even louder. A timber surveyor passing through town lent a moisture meter, curious after hearing repeated mentions of the wrapped house. Sarah helped record the readings, her careful handwriting, capturing what everyone could feel but needed to see confirmed. Walter's inner stacks measured between 12 and 14% moisture. The outer stacks stayed within usable range. Across the neighborhood, exposed piles hovered well above 25. The difference translated into fewer hours, chopping fewer mornings, coughing through smoky rooms, fewer nights spent feeding a stubborn fire. It translated into sleep, into health. No one in Walter's house caught a winter illness that year. Rex did not develop the wheezing cough that had worried Walter the previous spring. These outcomes did not announce themselves with fanfare. They accumulated quietly, like heat held overnight. As the snowpack began to shrink and the sun climbed higher, subtle changes appeared along the street. Lumber deliveries arrived. Measuring tapes re-emerged. Chalk lines were drawn. James Callahan began building his own wrap this time, asking questions before driving nails. Mark Jensen adapted the design to his smaller house, narrowing one side where space allowed widening another where wind hit hardest. Evelyn Carter coordinated neighbors, her administrative instincts resurfacing, ensuring shared tools and schedules. Walter watched from his porch, Rex seated beside him, tail thumping softly against the boards. He did not feel pride so much as a distant satisfaction, the kind that comes when a long-held principle proves itself without needing defense. Spring arrived, unevenly, snow lingering in shaded corners, while puddles formed in the sun. The corridor that had been mocked now served new purposes. Walter used it to dry boots, to stack tools, to walk Rex during late snowstorms without risking ice. Others discovered similar uses: storage, sheltered work, even a place to sit when the wind was sharp, but the light inviting. The technique spread not because Walter promoted it, but because winter had tested it and found it sound. One evening near the equinox, as the sky burned orange and pink over the thawing street, Sarah joined Walter on the porch. She looked tired but lighter, her pale face relaxed, chestnut hair loose around her shoulders. "People learn faster when they're cold," she said with a small smile. Walter nodded. He understood that truth intimately. Rex leaned against his leg, solid and warm, and Walter rested a hand on the dog's broad back, feeling the steady rise and fall beneath his palm. He thought about the first laughter, the isolation of building alone, the nights when doubt whispered that he might be wrong. He thought about how often in his life preparation had been mistaken for fear, caution, for weakness. Winter had corrected that misunderstanding. When the last of the snow finally retreated, Duluth looked different, not transformed but adjusted. Wrapped houses dotted the street, some complete, some in progress, each an acknowledgement rather than a monument. Walter returned to his quiet routines, splitting less wood, now repairing tools, walking Rex along cleared paths. The laughter never returned. In its place was a shared understanding that some ideas look foolish until conditions strip away pretense. On a final cold evening before true spring, Walter and Rex sat side by side on the porch, watching the light fade. The veteran's lined face softened, the dog's amber eyes reflecting the calm of warmth earned. Winter had been met, measured, and mastered not with force but with foresight. And that Walter knew was enough. In the end, this story is not really about wood walls or winter. It is about the quiet ways God works through patience, humility, and preparation. What looked foolish to others became a blessing, because it was built with care, responsibility, and love for life. Sometimes God does not send miracles as thunder or fire. Sometimes He sends them as simple ideas, steady hands, and the courage to keep going when others laugh. In our daily lives, we face our own winter's moments of uncertainty, fear, and exhaustion. And just like Walter, we are often given small wisdoms, gentle nudges, or quiet insights that don't look impressive at first. But when we act on them with faith, those small steps can protect us, warm us, and even bless the people around us. Preparation is not a lack of faith. It is often faith in action. If this story touched you, take a moment to share it with someone who might be facing a hard season right now. Leave a comment below and tell us what winter you're preparing for in your own life or where you're watching from. We would love to hear your story. And if you believe, as we do, that there is wisdom hidden in ordinary lives and forgotten lessons, please subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next story. May God bless you and your home. May He protect you through every storm, guide your hands in moments of doubt, and give you warmth both in your heart and in your life when the world feels cold. And may His peace walk with you today and always.